good decisions probably save you more money than bad decisions. I might not be able to tell you the dollar amount, but given sort of the price of what I charge and most training people would charge over the course of a lifetime of a company, a bunch of good decisions is, 10 years of good decision making is probably going to easily pay this thing up.
He's the data guy and he wants to have a talk with his business pals while they're off the clock on podcast like a business.
I have the pleasure of introducing today Mr. Brad Kolar, a distinguished author and an educator. And I love your focus on getting people to think about making decisions using the right data, not necessarily the underlying nitty-gritty data itself today. We're going to talk about what can people do with that decision making. What are good practices around making those decisions, right? And that's your forte?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's an interesting forte. I sort of stumbled upon this accidentally, which I think is what makes it so fun for me. I've always had an interest in data and analysis. And I think one advantage I've had is that I came up in the data world as a consumer of data and analytics rather than a producer. And what I mean by that is that's sort of how the world is broken up, right? We've got the analytics teams who are producers and then executives who are consumers. But I didn't grow up, in programs that were all about your career is going to be a data person. My career was always to be a something else that required me to use data to do that better. And I think that's really what has influenced my focus so much is because for me, it's always been about the application of the result rather than the production of the result. It's given me a very different view on it. And so I've always had that interest in general. And so, when I did statistics in college, again, it wasn't statistics for the sake of statistics. It was we were doing research and I had to do the statistics because we had research questions to answer.
Yes.
And so that made a pretty big difference. And then where I really, really got into this pretty heavily was in 2007, I co-authored a book called The Brain Advantage. And it was a great book. It was right when neuroscience and cognitive psychology and behavioral economics were just starting to jump. No one was really talking about them yet. So we decided we would strike while the iron was hot.
Sure.
And we put this book together. And the book wasn't about just data and decision making. It was really a leadership book talking about different aspects of leadership and how you could be a better leader using all of this research that we're hearing about. And in the course of researching the book, I did stumble across the one section on decision making. And I was blown away. I was like, holy smokes, as humans, we are just really bad at this. But the problem is we're really bad at it, but we have no clue we're really bad at it. And in fact, we often think we're pretty good at it. And I just fell in love with this topic of data-driven decision-making. And so I sort of on my own, I started reading whatever I could, checking out research, checking out articles. And as I did that, I was building up this workshop that I have, one of the workshops that I have, Rethinking Data. And I kept sort of changing it around. My workshop originally was much more on the mechanical use of data in decision making. And now it's much more in the psychology of decision making and how the way you're using your data could get interrupted because of the way your brain works. So that's
fascinating.
It was a very strange journey, but I think it's been a really fun one. And it keeps me excited because I just think the topic is so fascinating.
Well, I love how you started that all too. You're like, well, I came up through it from this guy who had to receive data and make decisions. I came up from the exact opposite side. And maybe that's why it resonates so well, because I came up as a report builder and I was like, man, I wish I could just sit in the room and find out what these people are trying to do with this information so I could give them the better information. It's funny that you felt the same strain from the other side. Like, I want to make sure I'm making the right decisions and this is the right information. That's fascinating to me.
Yeah, and I think that's important because, I work with both executive teams now and I work with analytics teams. And I think where the analytics teams can have a lot of value if they want to position themselves, it's always remembering that what they do is in the service of someone who's trying to make a decision. And I know that sounds obvious, and there's no one in analytics in the world who would say, well, that's not what I do. Of course, everything I do. But even when I listen to people's language, I'll hear people say, gee, I wish I could figure out how to best get people to use my analysis. Well, that's an analysis-centric view of the world. That view of the world is these people are actually the agents whose value is using what you do, rather than thinking, no, I'm the agent whose value is enabling them. So that's what I mean when I talk about this producer-consumer mindset. It's not that analytics teams aren't thinking about the end user. They certainly are. But I think sometimes it's easy to forget that because our life might be the analytical part, that's not what that person on the other side really worries about. And if 100%. I have to convince you to use it, that's actually on me. It's not on my customer to figure out how to use my product. It's on me to make something that's usable.
Exactly. Oh, no, I totally agree with you on that. And I know we talked, I'm not going to give away your whole book, but I know we talked too about how it's not just about that decision-making process. It's about like, does the person need to see the data to actually trust it? Or do I know that the data systems are there and you and I can just have an actual meeting? And that's a very pivotal point a lot of companies try to get to. And I know it's like a unicorn aspiration that, oh, we'll all get in the room and just talk about the problem one day because we'll have known the data. But a lot of times you see people are like, well, let me see that graph. Show me the graph that shows you that it went down and all that kind of stuff. How do you help people migrate from that kind of mentality to a, let's come to the right decision and I trust the data that you have in front of you is okay. What does that mean to us, right? Like, how do you help people translate?
So there's a couple ways, one of them is very pragmatic. I tell everyone there's just a leap of faith that you have to take, that when you tell someone a clear story with reasonable evidence and that story makes sense, they're going to have less of a desire to see a lot of data. Now, they're going to want to see some data. No one's going to ever listen to your story and say, oh, that was a great story. Let me go do something about it. But they're not going to want to see as much. I think the problem we have is even when we say we're telling a story, we're always putting the focus on the data. And so I'm telling you the story, but I've got a giant chart behind me on a screen. Yep. Well, when you do that, you're focusing your audience on data. They're not paying attention to your story anymore. They're looking at that chart on the screen and they're picking out all of the unusual points on that chart. And so now you're trying to tell me about this conclusion that the chart gave us, and they're drilled down onto the one thing that happened one time 3 years ago on the graph. And so You've lost the story with them. And so that's because I tell everyone, they're like, oh, when we try to show less data, they actually ask us for more. I said, no, it's because you're still showing the data.
Exactly. And they'll do it all the time. I got rid of the table. It's a pie chart now. And it's like, but you added 4 colors and there's 3 pie charts and they all say the same thing. And so now there's this noise and confusion. And the analyst feels bad because they just want to deliver the best possible report. They want to make sure all the information that you need is available during your decision-making process that could help you. And they're kind of getting the coaching that we give. Like, you got to be proactive. You've got to try to give them information. But then at the same time, to your exact point, once you start showing them the chart, they just ask for the damn table again. When in reality, you both just need to accept that we trust the chart, we trust the table. If it's going down, what do we do about it? And let's talk about those decisions rather than the data that happened and, proving it, right?
Well, and that's sort of the second part. So the first part is the leap of faith. When people start getting a simple, clear story, if it makes sense to them, they will ask for less data. Not for no data, but for less data.
Well, then let's say, what if they don't see a clear story? What if they feel like, oh, you know what? This doesn't match up. And I'd be willing to bet most people listen to this are listening at a company where, yeah, the reports all get summed up at the end of the month, but if you try to look at them from different departments, they wouldn't match, and people are having, that kind of problem. That's a hard position to be in, and you've come into that a number of times. What do you do about that to where you get to a trusted enough point? I like to say.
Well, so there's a couple things you can do. And one is, to me, it's first of all, it's what do we want to trust? And what I mean by that is I don't want any person to take what I'm saying at 100% my word. I want them to think critically about what I'm saying. I want them to be on alert. What I tell it from the executive side is I always say, don't audit the data. Let's just make an assumption that for the most part you have competent people. Because if you can't trust your people to do an analysis and interpret it, get different people, right? So let's just make the assumption. But that doesn't mean you have to just blindly believe everything. What you need to audit is the thinking process. So if I come to you and say, one of my favorite examples, if I come to you and say, hey, I think our company should make a strategic play in streaming music because it's a growing market. The younger audiences are really into it, and there's a lot of cross pollination we could get with other kinds of products and services. Now, I could bring you a ton of data to prove that everything I just said was true, but if you're a bakery, that's the dumbest idea you ever heard. And so we don't make decisions based on data. We make decisions based on reasoning and criteria. And if the reasons I bring you for how I came to a conclusion are off, then we don't even have to talk about the data. The only time we have to talk about the data is if I say, okay, I came to this conclusion for these 3 reasons, and you disagree with one of the reasons. You say, well, I don't have that experience, but I've heard sales are plummeting in MP3s. Why are you telling me they're going up? Now we have a reason to go look at some data because we have to reconcile our understanding. And that's what I try to help people understand is it's okay to question, but start by questioning the reasoning. And then if the reasons come up and I look at those 3 reasons and say, you know what, I already knew those 3 things. Then I don't have to look at the data. Right? Yep. I don't have to look at data for things that I already know, already agree with, or don't care about. And on the flip side, if I'm an analyst, I should never show people data that they already know, already agree with, or don't care about. So we don't. I always say we don't want to make this a binary choice. I don't like this. This happens so much these days that everything is, here's the new way versus the old way. It's not show little data versus show a lot of data. I like to say it's about layering your data. So tell me the most simple story first. And then most of the time that simple story will get your decision maker 80 to 90% to the decision. Then they're going to tell you where they need some additional data to fill in some blanks so they could actually make the decision. But that's going to be a much more streamlined conversation because I'm going to leave 75% of the data in the appendix because they already knew it. They already agreed with it. They didn't care about it. And so it's not an either or. I always say my presentation might be 6 slides long, but my appendix might have 100 different things in it. And over the course of talking with different people, at some point, all 100 of those things might show up somewhere. They're never going to show up all in the same meeting, but someone's going to need page 75 one day. So we'll talk about that one. Someone else is going to need page, 15, and we're going to talk about that one. No one's ever going to want to see all 100 pages, but that's what we often do when we give people our information and we give people our presentations is we force them through the 100 pages rather than saying simple. If you question that, let me give you another simple layer. Okay, let me show you. You didn't like my second reason. You didn't think the market was down. Let me explain how I came to that conclusion. Well, I based that on these 3 things.
And I love that you do that in an appendix because it keeps that presentation short and succinct so you can get through those 6 pages to everybody there. And if half the room wants to dig into that, whether or not it went up or down, fine. That's a further meeting. You know what I think. It's in the appendix. Here's how I got where I got. I love that because then the focus is on the information, but the backup and the corroboration isn't hidden. It's not like you're trying to say, oh, just trust me. I've got it in my gut. I know the market of MP3s. It's there. It's just we're not going to belabor that, and to your point, a lot of times when I see people do quarterly business reviews, monthly business reviews or whatever, it's 9/10 just graphs and charts talking about it and then thumbs up, thumbs down. And then what are we going to do next month or quarter? Instead of like any strategic conversation. I love that you take that approach to it.
And that's why I advocate. And I have a rule. I call this the Karen Messina rule. And so Karen Messina was the person who used to cut my hair. And so, she's full of wisdom. The first time I ever went to Karen, she said, what clipper do you use on the sides of your hair? And so, with guys' haircuts, they have that little clipper. The lower the number, the more of a buzz you get. I said, well, I use a number 2 on the side. And she looked at me because number 2 is pretty short. She goes, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to do a number 4. And then I'm going to let you take a look at it. And then if you want, I could do the number 2. She said, because I could always take more off, but once it's off, I can't put it back on. And I had this epiphany that if we flip that, the same is true with data. If I start simple, I could always add more layers if you want them to help you understand. But if I start complicated and confuse you or focus you in the wrong place, I can never get it back to simple. So that's what I mean by layering.
That's such a good way to do it. I can't tell you how many projects I've had people want me to build a system that goes and harvests data when in reality, they just needed a one-time data pull and a little bit of thought leadership around it. You know what I mean? And that's all they needed for their decision. They didn't need a full automated whatever. That just never gets built. It just never gets prioritized, right? Because it's hard to justify. So then you operate without any of that information because you never did the one time. Because to your point, you never got the layers. You never said, I only need the one time right now. We'll come back to this later. Yeah, I've lived through that, man. When did you know data was everywhere? And did you know that data was going to be where it's at for you?
I mean, in a sense that, the data is everywhere. I think because I was, I've always sort of been on that consumer side. I always knew about it because my life always depended on my using it. Right. And so, in high school, I worked for my stepfather. I ran his retail store. Well, you can't run a retail store without data. So, it became, and to be honest, I mean, and this is going to sound really dumb, but you got to remember, I was like, very young at the time. I also managed his fabrication company for him. So they built shelves and display cases out of plastic. And
what a learning experience.
Oh, it was great. I was one of the luckiest people to sort of have that kind of available to me. So I quoted my first job. And basically I gave a price that we were going to lose so much money on because when I quoted it for the materials. And then so my stepdad sat me down and he's like, well, who's going to put those materials together? I said, well, that guy. He goes, well, we pay that guy, right? I'm like,
right.
Yeah. So then he's like, so don't we want to put that into and so he sort of walked me through and said, okay, when you think about pricing, you have to have a model in your head of what are all of the things that go into the price. I said, okay, so I figured it's going to be materials, it's going to be this. And so I'm like, okay, now I'm ready to make my price. He said, not yet. I said, why not? He goes, well, you have to think about something called margin. I said, well, what's margin mean? He goes, well, if the guy's making it and we're paying him and we're paying for the materials, I said, how are we going to afford the building that he's making it in and all the equipment that he's using? So I was quickly learning that like everything I did, there's this information I have to take into account. And then I said to him, well, how do you know how long it's going to take him? I said, I understand, but I said, how do I know how much to charge? He said, well, and this was really cool because it was one of these things where I had experienced this and never understood it. He said, when you're down there watching him and he has those little labels that he puts his start and end time on. I said, yeah. He said, well, we take all of those and we put them into a computer. And so we know for this kind of task on average, how long it takes him. So now if he's going to do. And so now he said, what you want to do is you need to write down all of the different tasks he's going to have to do to build this thing. And then you could look at this thing and apply, in this case, averages, which is funny because now I tell everyone never use averages. But he goes, you could apply that average time. But that was sort of the insight for me, the first insight of, okay, we're not just making decisions. We're not guessing how long it's going to take them. We're not asking him how long it's going to take them. We're actually collecting some information about what we've done in the past, and we're using that information to inform what we want to do to make a decision. How much should I charge? So for me, it was really that early on is when.
How old were you then? You said high school? So you're like 17?
Freshman year of high school. So.
Wow. What a good experience, man. Yeah, that ingrains it in you.
Yeah, because by then, so my freshman year, I had already started programming. And so that was the other cool thing. I built him, and this was funny. I mean, 90% of the people on listening to this are going to have no idea what I'm talking about. I built him a Lotus 1-2-3 estimating system that basically all that data that he had, they used to have all those calculations by hand. I created him a system where they were able to sort of put in the parts inventory for the project, put in the tasks, and it would automatically give him
that had to change so much for him.
And so, so for me, I was learning the program, but at the same time, when you're learning how to program an estimating system, you very quickly learn about the importance of data, right?
Oh yeah.
So that's really for me where it all started.
Wow. Yeah, you were right head on into the career, a little bit in the management side, and then bam, I want to do this for a living. But yeah, I mean, it was one of those things too for me when I started working with like databases. I was managing a CRM for insurance sales, and I was just managing my own CRM, and I had to manage the fields and what custom fields and all that stuff. And you're just like, I want to get good at this. I totally could see you playing around in Lotus and being like, well, if I just add this little bit, it makes this whole thing simpler. And that's exactly how I did it in Excel, right? Like I came up through Excel and I start making macros and formulas and stuff. And you automate away the parts you can. So you're spending more time on the parts you want to and need to and add the value. But man, that's so cool. You started so young. Like, wow, what an experience.
So what was the first, because you remember, what was the first thing you automated in Excel? Can you remember?
Jeez, I don't even remember. I know before I had a job at it, I had a friend of mine who did a granite company, and his estimator had just missed 1 inch off of the small side of the shelf between the stove and the wall in an entire apartment complex. And they wouldn't be able to open the building without the shelf, without the counters in place. And this guy was off by 1 inch too short. So now you can't stretch granite. It just doesn't work that way. So he has to reorder it from China, recut it, re-get it installed. And if they're behind on the deadline, they had to pay to put all these people up in a hotel who would have otherwise moved in, because that's just part of that deal of when you're taking on those contracts. And so I just wrote him something in Excel that his salesperson could use where he could only do the right things, had to measure it 2 or 3 times and fill out the sheet. I didn't even charge him. I mean, we're talking 20 years ago. Back in the day, I wasn't even doing this professionally. And I found out 10 years later, they used that for a decade. They kept using that because it was the double checks that had people make sure they didn't miss that 1 inch, but also didn't oversell and didn't overprice or underprice, gave them a range of stuff. And I was like, wow, this is really cool. The first thing that I automated into a system was when I was working in food safety. We had a bunch of people who came with like a stack of papers, and I would type in prices and stuff, like how many boxes of cereal and what price on what shelf. And I just wrote a macro, so I would just have to type the 4 letters or the 4 numbers instead of having to type 12 columns. And so, yeah, I got that done in like, the middle of the day. I was done, and they're like, that was your work for the week, Rob. Like, what are you going to do? And I said, I don't know. All these people look busy. I'm sure there's more work to do. And that's how I got into reporting. And I started doing what they give me at the time, crystal reports, if you want to talk about old software that nobody will understand anymore. But I got really good at that because it was reading and writing to SQL. I had to learn how to write my SQL views to make the reports run really well because I didn't have all the fancy stuff you have in the cool tools nowadays. So I was like, all right, I can do that. But I was doing that for customers because I was thinking of somebody who was like you, who is going to get this report, have like a 1-hour meeting and decide what they're doing for the next quarter off of it. And I'm like, I got to simplify this. I've got to make this as easy to get as much information as I can without making it sound confusing. And I just got addicted to it, man. I knew that that's what I wanted to do. I liked building those systems. I liked automating those processes. And I mean, nobody likes doing the same thing in Excel every month. I've got so many of my friends that are like, Rob, could you help me like automate this? And I would love to do all of them. I'm going to start a series where I start building little like tools that I'll sell for like a couple bucks online. So you can just copy my template and use it. How do you compare two things really easily? How do you imagine a sheet that just has basic statistics in it, the standard deviation, min, max, and the stuff that people know that can be done in Excel, but it also is too annoying. But I like helping them with that stuff because I feel like it gives them better decision making than here's my 100 people. I've got to distribute the wealth for next year. Who gets 3%? Who gets 5%? It's like you can do a lot with statistics, and then you can figure out what data do you want to pull into that to reward the people who are really doing the most and not punish the ones who aren't, but not reward the ones who are just barely getting by. You have to figure that out. Yeah. So it's fun.
I used to have a running, I had this Excel add-in that I created, and basically it was an add-in of just it was just macros and functions and subroutines, just that automated everything I would do and my team would do. So every time I saw someone doing something, again, my rule is if you ever do something twice in a row, automate it. And so I would write something. And so over the course of my career, this library grew and grew and grew and grew until suddenly it was just all of these little simple automations, just like you said, just to do really simple things. Ironically enough, 90% of the things that are in there eventually got built into Excel. But, in the early days, that people weren't thinking about automating in Excel. They were just trying to figure out how to use it to just do the basic arithmetic and statistical functions. So it's interesting to see how Excel sort of caught up on the fact, and they started to realize that people are actually using this to do more than just discrete calculations once in a while. And I think it's cool that it's evolved that way.
Well, what blows my mind with the way Excel is right now, and especially with you, is like people who I think who do what you do, who have to go make better decisions and actually consult on how people make decisions. In the 1980s and 90s, they were using green pieces of graph paper, much like this. And they were taking hella guesses at what they should do. And, you do it, you build the principles and you have models and you build rules, but they weren't running like realistic statistical analysis of by product, what sold and didn't sell. And you know what? They didn't go out of business. Does that mean you need to do that all now? No. Does that mean it wouldn't behoove you to start identifying your best and worst products and customers? Yeah, it absolutely would. And I think most companies under $10 million could probably do a lot of that in Excel, at least a lot more than zero, right? But like after a while, you need these advanced systems. My boss, when I was at one of my former companies, built a system when he was at Grainger, which is a big supply company. And this is, 10 years ago, I worked for him. It was 5 or 6 years before that he built it. And they could predict when people would cancel based on how they would change their order quantities. When their orders started dipping on certain products, they knew they had so many more months left. And that's cool. Early 2000s. And so like when you think of what big companies like that can do now, it's insane to think of the AI around it. But somebody like me doesn't necessarily need that. I don't need to have all this crazy AI data stuff. Do I have an analyst building something that scrapes LinkedIn to give me all the jobs and simplify it? Well, yes, because I can, but it doesn't mean you need to, right? Like I could pick 20 jobs to do the same thing from it, technically.
Yeah, I think it's just that same, everyone is always looking for like the one new thing that's gonna do everything. And there's, and I've heard just throughout my career, X is dead. Call it whatever you want. Paper is dead, right? Excel is dead. Computer-based training is dead. Everything's dead. Yes. And none of it's ever dead. All of it just its uses change, and again, like we've talked about, if you're just looking at your budget Excel does a pretty good job. Like you said, I don't need Python. I don't need some big machine learning module just to find out if I've spent more than I've brought in. Now, I might need some of those things if I want to start modeling what's influencing how much money is coming in. But I think that everyone wants it to be just one product or one program or one technology, rather than saying each of these have a purpose. And the risk, though, and the downside of Excel, and actually I would even say, we see it with a little bit of the AI and machine learning, and most of the Microsoft products actually, is that Microsoft products now allow people to do things that they don't know how to do. And you saw this first with PowerPoint, right?
Yep.
When I was growing up, you couldn't make presentations in business. You had a graphics department who were the only people who knew how to do this. So you would have to go and you would actually have to be able to explain to them what you were trying to do. And they had people who were really good at visualizing and professionally designing things.
Right,
now,
drawing art and all that, like the whole thing.
Right, and thinking about how do I represent this idea. Now anyone could go into into PowerPoint and create a presentation. And there's no cost for an extra slide. In the old days, you had to give those people money, right? You had a budget for graphics. So you had to think really carefully about what you wanted to put. Now you go into PowerPoint, it's got all these pre-made templates. And so it could automate creating a really bad presentation if you don't understand what you're trying to accomplish. The worst invention ever, and I don't know if they took it out, was the auto-fit text box. Because, in the old days, it was don't put too much information on a slide. And then PowerPoint comes along and they're like, hey, if you're putting too much information on, we're going to actually make it easier. We're going to automatically shrink your text so you can put even more crap on the slide.
God, that's all my college years. We used to call it death by PowerPoint because you just get like walls of text and you're like,
just put more and more on there. And Excel is the same way. I mean, think about it now. In Excel, I don't have to know anything about statistics to run a regression in Excel. Right. I could just have my data. I could look at the help file and say, okay, I know how I need to feed this, but I don't even have to understand really the difference between an independent and a dependent variable. Nope. And I just have to know that I have to put one column in as the dependent, one as but if I don't know the relationship, I'm going to run the regression backwards.
Well, 100%. And if you're getting the sample or the population, I mean, you may be doing it on the whole wrong set of data,
exactly. And I could make graphs of things that maybe I shouldn't have graphed, or I could choose the wrong graph, but it's easy. And that's what I worry about
and it's easy to believe you're not wrong is the problem. It's not only easy to do, but it's easy to trick yourself into being like, yeah, not only is this right, damn, I'm
it's
good.
You know what I mean? Because it looks so good. And so I think it looks
convincing.
Is what we sometimes forget, right? I mean, to me, one of the times, like from an automation, the time I learned when there's actually data is really important, but understanding what you're talking about turns out to be even more important. When I was in college, I took a real estate course, and we had to do this model about leveraging your real estate investment. So we had to apply some kind of leverage model to figure out how much money you were going to have. Nice. And the instructor gave us like 50 transactions that we had to apply this model to. And so the next morning, everyone came in, everyone's complaining. They're like, that thing took me all night, because they all did it by hand. And they're like, how long did it take you? I said, it took me 5 minutes. They're like, what do you mean? I said, I wrote a formula and I copied it down 50 times and I was done. And they're like, oh man, that's something. Well, then we get the grades, and they all passed. I got an F because it turned out I didn't understand it and I wrote the wrong formula.
But you were done super quick, huh?
And because it was a formula and applied to everyone, it wasn't that I missed some. I missed every single one. And so
you just answered our next question: is when has data burned you? And I think that is a fantastic example of when data has burned you, because you just get so much trust in the system. You're like, Excel wouldn't lie to me. She's my
It gave me an answer. I didn't get an error message. It gave me an efficient. It gave me an efficient way to get the wrong answer. And it gave me an efficient way to get the wrong answer at scale, right?
Yeah, right. Quickly, and a lot of it.
That was sort of a bummer. The other thing, that question about when data burned you is interesting, because I just had data burn me, and it's in a little different way than this. So everyone's got the story.
Color me interested.
The data said one thing. It's more sort of the impression of how the use of data burns you. So I was just negotiating with the client. My contract ran out. We were negotiating the new contract. And I tend to take a pretty relational view with my clients. How can we serve both of our interests, all that stuff. And it was funny, as we were negotiating, they weren't taking that position, by the way. We were negotiating. And basically, if I was auditing this discussion, they made every possible mistake that you could make with data during the negotiation. They cherry picked. We were talking about sort of like future revenue, and they kept picking the biggest year they ever had with me, which was twice as big as the average year, and they were basing everything off of that. And I'm like,
they should have taken your class.
No, and I'm like, that's all right. And then they kept changing from. They would talk about things in aggregate, like, well, the overall amount we're paying is this much. And so then I would talk about things in aggregate, because I'm like, okay, so we're talking about a difference of $20,000 in aggregate. You're saying you feel like that's a lot of money for me to increase my price. I said, your company just had X tens of billions of dollars in gross profit. This is 0.000013% of that. This is non-material to you.
Right.
And then they're like, well, we shouldn't really be talking at the aggregate. I'm like, you opened up the aggregate conversation.
Yeah, exactly.
By telling me and so on and on. There's about 10 things they did that if I was giving a class on how not to use data, they sort of hit every single one.
You got to love it.
But I lost the negotiation. And the reason that I lost the negotiation was, in the end of the day, they didn't care about using data to make this decision.
They were just trying to figure out how to communicate the decision to you.
Well, or they were basically the choice wasn't how can we come up with a fair agreement. The choice was, we're a really big company. You're a really small company. You probably need us more than we need you. So here's what we're going to offer you. And here's the decision.
Yes.
The decision is, do you want to still work with us? Right. And that was it. There's no data involved. But it was one of those things where I was thinking, wow, they did everything wrong. I did everything right. And none of it mattered because this conversation had nothing to do with data. So that's where I would say, probably not the data burned me, but sort of my belief in data burned me, because I was entertaining. I thought we were having a conversation about a database conversation, and I should have known. That's on me. I should have figured out pretty quickly that this is a power conversation and I need to adjust. And first of all, it could have been a much faster conversation. I could have just said, okay, fine, I want to work with you. We don't have to talk for 2 hours about all of the data. So that's when I would say data sort of bit me.
Woo, man, I appreciate that one. That's a very real one, man.
I always say, don't bring data to a gunfight.
No, man. Do not. And it's hard because, like, I'm sure that person was trained to try to use data to justify or soften the blow or whatever, right? Because that person probably has a budget they've got to reduce by 10% this year is what they come down to. Yeah, and it's also hard with training to quantify. I like to say in the stuff we do, consulting or even in training, the better you do, the less it's going to show that it happened. Like if I do a great job consulting, you have a system that's running at your site that you're not touching. That means, you're not likely to call me and tell me I did great in a year because you're just like, oh yeah, I guess that's working still. Same with all the people you train. The ones who are doing great, they're not going to attribute the training they took a year ago. They're going to be like, man, that guy was a rock star. We knew it.
Yeah, it's exactly. The only time they're going to know is when it doesn't work, right? And that's the hard part. I had a friend who was vice president of facilities at the University of Chicago Medical Center.
Oh wow!
And he told me, he said the hardest part about his job is that when he does his job really well, nobody notices, right? Because when the HVAC system is working, nobody notices.
Nobody gets a phone call for that.
The only time they notice is when the heat's off and it's 0 degrees in Chicago. And so, I think we run into the same thing. And that's what's actually hard with the decision making, right? It's when someone says, well, what's the how much are you saving us by making us make better decisions? I'll say, well, what's the value of a good decision? What's the value of a bad decision? It's really hard to, there's a specific decision we might be able to quantify if you get it right or wrong, but decision making in general, given the number of decisions and I remember way back, one company tried to quantify it and it was I called it a lottery based ROI. They're like, in this company, people make loans and these loans can be in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And if one person makes one mistake, it could destroy our quarter. And so the ROI was, it doesn't really matter if the training is going to cost $2 million because just one person making one mistake could cost the company $200 or $300 million. Well, while all that is true, that's sort of the right. It's like the reverse lottery. If we get super unlucky, I'm like, I can't base it on one person doing one thing wrong one time in a catastrophic situation. No,
there's no way to make a training that makes sure nobody ever does anything wrong ever. Yeah. I mean, the billions of dollars you would have to charge in training and like retraining and validation is.
And to try to take credit for, I'm potentially saving you hundreds of $1 million. That's not realistic either.
The reason you had no errors is because of my training. Yeah, go ahead and put that in your next sales pitch. I want to make sure they believe that one.
So so I think it's hard because when you're teaching, even though they call it soft, when you're teaching a thinking skill, it's hard to quantify a thinking skill. Although but it's also hard to disagree that good decisions probably save you more money than bad decisions. I might not be able to tell you the dollar amount, but given sort of the price of what I charge and most training people would charge over the course of a lifetime of a company, a bunch of good decisions is 10 years of good decision making is probably going to easily pay this thing up. A year is because we're not paying that much to help people become better decision makers.
What was that old cartoon that's CFO says, well, what if, how much it'll cost if we have to train everybody and they leave? And then the CEO says, well, what if we don't train everybody and they stay? And I think about that all the time, you're saving all the training costs and you have a bunch of untrained people. So good luck. But absolutely. I think that, I think that's coming around lately. I know that a lot of companies, the ones you work with are relatively large companies, but I know a lot of small companies would try to use like Udemy Business or whatever because they realize they have to invest in their people. It's not just about salary anymore. It's not just about benefits. Yeah. It's flexible relationships and improvement of your people is what's going to win the relationship war with employers, in my opinion, because those are the ones you want to work for, the ones who want to help me level up while I'm helping you level up, not so much just let me go take that analyst job and I'll go pitch to the customer every month and I'll sit down and shut up that I don't get my promotion. I think that kind of mentality in these large companies is transitioning. But I think people like you are, I don't want to say instrumental, but I kind of do because big companies don't know how to train that stuff. Where would you learn that stuff outside of an outside trainer coming in? And I know a lot of people who don't work in the business world and they don't get any professional development. They're nurses and they're teachers and they're great people who do great work and they don't get mandated. This is how you improve the way you think. This is how you improve the way you interact with people. And I'm so thankful for all those trainings I've been able to go through over the years, and the stuff you're providing, I think, is important.
Yeah. Well, and the problem, and I know this, it's not a training podcast, but the problem that I've seen in training, in the past decade or so is training has become very transactional. In that we're training people how to execute the transactional or procedural parts of their job, which is important. Don't get me wrong. And part of that, I think, is one, that actually is pretty easy to quantify, right? I could say, on average, it used to take you 10 minutes to fill out this form. Now it takes you 2 minutes to fill out. I could calculate how much we saved.
Yep.
The problem that I see, and that's actually what happens, when you mentioned the nursing and the medical. When I was the chief learning officer at the University of Chicago Medical Center, and one thing that I couldn't believe when I saw it, it was very hard for us to do a lot of what I would call professional development training because there are so many mandates on the functional and technical training, right? And what you want to make sure that nurses are learning how to use infusion pumps properly and keep patients safe.
Right.
But they have so much of that, there's no time or money left to teach them critical thinking, which is 100%. Really important. Right?
100%.
And I even see that in corporations is that everyone wants to teach the transactional, but at the end of the day, if very few corporations win or lose in the long run based on how well they get the transactions. You got to get them, but you're going to lose a banking customer because you blew the relationship, not because you blew the transaction.
Well, now you made me think of a data thing with medical, man. You got me going now. My dad actually was just in a hospital, and he had fallen down recently, so he was a fall risk. Now, my wife is a former nurse, and she had done research at this hospital. She had worked at this hospital before, been on the floor he was going to be on, knew the doctors on the floor, knew the procedures. And they're like, if you're a fall risk, you're going to have a little thing that goes under you on the bed where if you get up, it's going to say, please lay down, please lay down, please lay down. Because the hospitals, if somebody's there and falls, everything that if he broke his arm or leg, all of that is on the hospital to pay for. So it's a huge liability for the hospital. They've done a ton of studies internally from people like my wife who would go take surveys and find out how people fell, how could we have prevented the fall. And they put all these things together to stop him from falling. And it sounds good, but he left against medical advice on day 2 because it was so annoying he couldn't sleep. He's like, I can't even get better here. I need to go home and pass out. He passed out for like 18 hours. He was fine. He emailed the doctor. But it was just their data told them, well, we need to make this person safe. We need to make sure this is here. This will make sure they don't fall. And they were right because they just pushed the customer right out the door. Now they're not liable at all because they're just like, meh, not our problem anymore. Now that wasn't their goal. But that's what happens when you focus on the data too much and you're just like, we'll have no more fall patients. Well, yeah, because you'll just kick out anybody who's at all likely to fall, which is a huge population of people in the hospital, you know? So it's wild to see that happen firsthand, you know, like.
There's a great article when you said that. I wish I had the name of it, but my friend Bill Welter sent it to me, and it was an article written in one of the big, it might've been in the Atlantic. And the guy's sort of talking about sort of almost the negative effect of all this data. And he starts out by talking about baseball. And, you know, baseball was sort of like the thing that was part of the big data boom with Moneyball and everything.
Hell yeah. Oh, yeah.
But he said
huge.
now, he's like, but if you look at it now, they've gotten so good with baseball analytics. He said baseball has become boring. He goes, there's more strikeouts now than there ever were before because they know exactly what to pitch, when to pitch, how to pitch it, when to replace the pitcher. And he said, so there's a lot more strikeouts. He said, now it turns out there's a lot of home runs too, but there's very few things in between anymore. And so he was sort of saying like, we've optimized the fun and interest out of baseball with the analytics. And then he was talking about, the article talks about movies. And he said the same thing. He said, because we're being so data driven at the movies, he said, you never see anything new anymore. Every movie is a derivation, right? It's the next Marvel movie, or it's the number 4 of whatever sequel, you know, whatever sequence, because the data says people want to keep seeing this. And so he said, we're really losing the creative or sort of the unique novel aspect of life because we're starting to optimize everything against, you know, what the data exactly tell us to do. And I just thought that was I hadn't thought about that perspective before, but I think it's a really interesting perspective to think about.
Yeah, it terrifies me sometimes, man. Yeah.
That perspective is actually something that we see a lot in the space that I spend a lot of time in. I play a lot of MMORPG video games, massive multiplayer online role-playing games. And the games, like the one that comes to mind immediately is one called RuneScape. I don't know if you're familiar. It's been around for like 22 years.
My son was a big RuneScape player.
So I still play to this day, but that game it's exactly that. We have a wiki that has 20 years of people adding information to it. Every part of that game has been optimized. You don't just explore around and kill this monster because you're there anymore, because you're not getting the most efficient experience. Or this monster has a 30% better drop chance on that item that this one has. And so that's been something I've been complaining about for probably a better part of a decade when it comes to video games. Everything's too optimized. You're either trying to play to be a professional, or the community at large doesn't think you should be playing that video game anymore.
Interesting. That's so interesting. It sort of reminds me of, and I wasn't even a big Star Trek fan, but for whatever reason, this episode always stood out, and I'm probably going to get it wrong, but there was an episode where whatever planet they were on didn't fight wars anymore, because they had such good analytics and such good models to figure out who would have won. They just run all the data, and then they just kill the appropriate number of people on both sides and declare one side a winner. Right?
That almost sounds too real.
Because they had optimized it. But to me, sort of the step back from that, which is interesting, that gets back to sort of the humans. Remember, the consumer side of all of this was they optimized the data to a point where they were so good at predicting the result of the war. They stopped thinking about how do we prevent the war. They're like, let's just assume the war is going to happen. Let's just run the numbers and just take care of this.
Yes.
And we sort of lost the creative part, which is how do we not get into a war in the first place? And I think that's what we're saying. We're optimizing all of these battles without thinking about how do we even change the relationship before we get to the battles and change how things are happening. So I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's a weird time to be involved in those decision-making things. Well, and to your point too, I love that you gave the example you did on getting burned by data, because we could teach them the best we can, have all the information available, and serve it to them on a silver platter. And they could be like, my gut says to do it this way, and I've been doing it for 20 years, and I appreciate it. So it's like, you do the best you can. You hope you can give them all the information they can. They could listen to it. They could not, because they could get burned too. And that's up to them. And that's a respect I've got to give somebody. It is your decision at the end of the day. You know, if I'm offering a bunch of information, you're the one who's got to live with it, you know?
I think that's the thing. That's what I really try to emphasize. And again, it depends who you're talking to. But so often, most of us are often in a role where we are advising someone who's making a decision. We're not the ones who are making the decision. And I think we forget that. And when we go in, we're like, well, how could I convince them that my interpretation and recommendation were correct? And
define you're a good analyst if you can convince them, right? Yeah, I totally know what you said. Yeah, I've been there.
And the way I've tried to flip that is to say, my job is how can I help them decide whether they agree with me as easily or disagree with me as quickly and easily as possible? Because I don't care which side they come. I shouldn't, if it's their decision, care which side they come out on. What I should care about is, were they able to quickly figure out and make that decision. And that totally changes how I approach it, because one of the things I always teach in my workshop is when you're presenting your recommendation, you always have to provide the contrary evidence. And people are always like, well, why in the world would I explain the stuff that doesn't support my recommendation?
Yep.
I said, because your job is to ensure that that person is making an informed decision. It's not to manipulate them to your side. Now, there probably are situations where somebody is in a combative situation where maybe they are trying to manipulate you. But if you're trying to help people with ethical decision making, your role isn't to withhold data. Your role is to present all of the data in the most effective way so they could come to a conclusion. Right? Theoretically, that's what a court system is supposed to do, right?
Right.
You're supposed to be, that's why we have all these rules of evidence. Juries are supposed to be getting the data in a way that makes it easy for them to decide if they want to agree. Now that gets abused and people try to manipulate how and where that data is presented to give themselves an edge. But the idea of it isn't supposed to be that. The idea is supposed to be, you're supposed to get enough information to make an informed decision about the guilt or innocence or the culpability, whatever, of the people involved.
And you've actually seen that a lot too. Like even a lot of that, the herd stuff, and everybody is watching that's when people watch trials, is when celebrities get sued or sue each other. And I mean, like, there wasn't a lot of surprise. Like back in, I remember the O.J. Simpson days, it was like, what about this? What about that? And it was like theater. But like now it's like, no, everybody should know everything in advance. This shouldn't be surprise theater anymore in court. But it does feel like that when you're in business meetings. It does feel like, the guy you're going up against in the sales pitch may pull a rabbit out of his hat that isn't true, and you don't have the data to debunk it unless you've, to your point, got in front of you. Here's what I know. Here's what we knew about him before. Now, if that's changed and he's telling us it's changed, then okay, that's news to me too, right? Because that's news. But this is why we said it wasn't good to go with him.
And that's the thing sometimes we talk about is, to me, I'm really big on this idea of decision criteria, right? And I mentioned it before. You don't make decisions based on data. You make decisions based on criteria. And again, that goes back to your question about trust. It's not that I don't always trust your data. Sometimes I don't trust that the criteria you're presenting are the one that I might think you cherry picked the criteria that gave you the best case. And so the best way to build trust is for you and I to actually agree upon the criteria before the analysis is done. That way, when you come to me and say, we're making this decision and this decision was based on these 4 things, I can't come back to you and say, well, I don't like those 4 things because we agreed to them. But then on the other hand, if when the decision comes back, I realize there's a 5th thing that we didn't talk about, what happens in a meeting is now I start to advocate for that 5th thing while we're trying to make the decision. Yep. And that's when it gets really heated, because now you get defensive because you like your decision that worked without my 5th thing. So I tell people, if someone brings up a new criteria, it's not a bad thing, but we have to take a step back and stop and say, okay, wait. The analysis is no longer relevant. If we're
right, what we thought has changed.
Yeah, we first have to decide, is this decision going to be based on this additional criteria? And if so, we have to go rerun the whole analysis to incorporate that criteria. But it makes that trust equation much better, because if I have 3 people involved, again, I'm not advocating for the decision. I don't care if they had the criteria, but I sort of work the process and say to the group, now, when we started, you all said it was only these 4. Maybe we missed it. Do all of you agree that we missed it? And if not, if only this person thinks we missed it, as a collective group, we're going to go forward with the original criteria. Let them govern which criteria they're going to use. My job isn't to defend the criteria. It's to ensure they're all using a common set, whatever they happen to be. And that's where I see most decision-making go astray, is you have 2 people looking at the same data and they come to wildly different conclusions, even though they agree on the data. Well, that means they're using a different set of criteria, and that doesn't work. And I spend a lot of my time at the executive level working with executive teams to make sure that they're all using the same criteria in their decision making. And it sounds super obvious, but most of them don't.
It does, doesn't it? No, I totally know what you're saying. It's like, well, how are you counting units? They're like, well, we count units that are billed versus we count units that were produced. And I'm like, that alone doesn't sound like a big deal. But you're talking about, there's a lot of work in progress. There's a lot of people's time. To your point on the bins of your dad before with the start and end time, there's a lot of units that have timestamps still running that you're not considering correctly, And
so, I mean, sometimes the criteria are down at that rule level, like you said, what counts. Sometimes it's the higher level. Like, I'll give you a real simple example. I was working with one company. The senior vice president brought me down, and he said, every month we get an amount of discretionary marketing money to do whatever we want with for our business unit. We get it from corporate. He said, so, but we don't know what it's going to be every month. It depends on all these factors.
Oh.
So once we get the number, I'll tell my team, my vice presidents, like, okay, we've got $10 million this month to spend on marketing. And I'll ask them, and he would ask them to come back with a recommendation. Every month they come back, he disagreed with the recommendation every month. Now, so he's mad and frustrated because he's like, we're not doing anything because we can't agree. The vice presidents are naturally mad because they're wasting their time every month. They know that whatever they come up with, he's not going to agree with.
Right.
And so they brought me down and we had this criteria discussion. And I just said, everybody write down how you decide where to spend the money. What are you basing this decision on? And what happened was the vice presidents were in complete agreement. They said we're focusing on places where we're below target and losing market share, where we have poor customer satisfaction, and where we have our sales forces disengaged. So basically, they were taking a remedial strategy, right?
They're doing a retention campaign.
Yeah, let's put the money where it's broken. The senior vice president said, I want to put the money basically all the opposite. He wanted to invest where it works. He goes, I want to go where we're growing, where our sales force is engaged and where our customers are happy. So they looked at the data.
And neither of them are really wrong, right? So it's not like you can just walk in and be like, well, this guy's obviously right.
Well, that's what I always say. It's not about that there's one set of right criteria. What matters is, are we using the same set? Because they all agreed on the data. They could all agree that these 5 locations are ones that are losing sales or whatever. They didn't disagree on the data, but because they had a different set of criteria, one group said this is where we should focus, the other one didn't. Once we got them aligned with their criteria, those meetings started to go really fast.
Oh, for sure.
Right?
Why couldn't you just do a little bit in both areas and realize you're taking a part of? Yeah, I could see that working very well.
Criteria is huge. I mean, I spend a lot of time talking about criteria. Decisions are based on criteria. Data are just there to inform whether the criteria have been met or not. But it's not about
I think it was
data.
our previous conversation that we brought up too. It's very similar to this, that like, it's not that people need this help. It's that they don't know it. Like they don't think to ask about this stuff. Like, no, man, I'm an accountant. I know how to use spreadsheets. I don't need your help. And not that accountants don't know spreadsheets, but they use them a bunch of different ways depending on what you're accounting for. You know what I mean? And what decisions you're making out of it. Like, so it's hard to say, well, I've got an ability with Excel, Rob. I don't need decision-making support, or I don't need to get better at that. How do you help people who are maybe coming around to that, or maybe open to the idea of, let me get better at this, even though I've got some background in spreadsheets and maybe I got some bad habits in the way I do things currently? How can I get more focused to be decision-making mindset, I guess?
So I call it being decision-driven. And that's intentional. Perfect. Because it's contrasting with data-driven. But again,
you like to simplify. I see right above your.
I do like to simplify. It's my halo, right above my head. But I use the word driven. I contrast it with data-driven. But like I said earlier, it's not a choice. It's not you can be decision-driven or you can be data-driven. It's you need to actually do both. I can't be decision-driven unless I'm also data-driven. Because if I'm decision-driven without data, I'm guessing. But it's all about where you ask your first set of questions. And so, for example, the common question you have when you're building a report often is, I've got this data. What's the best way for me to format it and present it? Now, that's a data-driven way of thinking about your data because, again, the goal is to present the data. In a decision-driven format, you would say, I've got a decision to make. What are the choices I have when I'm making that decision? And how can I represent the data according to the choices I'm making? And by the way, it's not even how can I represent the data? It's how can I represent the answer to the question according to my choices? So my reports don't have numbers on them. Because, for example, imagine that you're looking at your KPIs and you're looking at a balanced scorecard. And you decide when you're looking at your balanced scorecard, the way you figure out where you need to focus your attention is based on 2 things. It's based on how you're doing against your current target and how you're trending against the last month. Now, a decision or a data-driven report would show me my KPIs in the left column, and then it would have a column for what's the target, a column for what's the current, and a column for what was last month. And then maybe we would try to get a little fancy and we might color code red and green so you don't have to figure out that we're on target or not. We're telling you red or green. And maybe we would use a little arrow to show you what the trend is.
Yes.
That's still a data-driven report because what I'm actually doing is I'm giving you information about the data. Yep. Now, if I built this report, and this is hard to maybe visualize, my report in this particular case, and my decision-based reports all look different. But in this case, I would say, okay, you're making your decision across 2 dimensions. One dimension is how are we doing on the target? One dimension is what's the trend? So now I'm going to have 2 dimensions. And then I'll say, well, what are your choices when you look at the report? They'll say, well, either it could, I look at a metric and I don't have to worry about it. I said, okay, what's another choice? Well, I could look at a metric and it might be something that I need to focus on right away. I said, okay, so there's 2 choices. Do you have any more choices? He said, yeah. And some of the metrics are sort of in between. I don't have to do anything, but I need to keep an eye on. I can't forget them like the first category. So I said, okay, so you have 3 choices when you look at this report for how you're going to sort your metrics in your head. Then I just say, so how do you decide which choice? And he said, well, it's based on these 2 factors. If I'm hitting the target and getting better, well, that means I don't have to worry about it. I don't even want to think about those metrics. If I'm missing the target and getting worse, any metric that meets those criteria, that's the stuff I have to look at first. And then if I'm doing okay on one, but not the other, those are what are at risk. I have to keep an eye on them. I don't have to act on them.
Sure.
So my report is going to take those 2 dimensions and it's going to create a little 2x2. And so in the upper right corner, there's a green box and all of the metrics that met those criteria are going to be in that box.
Sure.
And then in the bottom left corner, there's going to be a box that's red for all of the metrics that are missing the target and decreasing. But I'm going to put all the metrics there because think about this from a decision-making standpoint. When I look at the report, I don't want to go line by line and figure out, is this, and have to ask those 2 questions and come to a conclusion that I have to work on something. I would rather look at my report and say, okay, I see all 7 things that are in trouble in one spot. I call this a decision-based. So that's a decision-based way of thinking about reporting.
Because then you're just going to go and dig in with the VP of sales because you see a low sales number. And then if you see a low operations number, that tells you what decision needs to be made based on the KPI, not just
exactly.
the number.
And that's the key. So I don't want to have to, and that's the problem with traditional reporting, right?
Yeah.
Is you have to go line by line. You have to do some kind of assessment on every line. Sometimes it's looking at 2 things. Sometimes it's looking at 5 things in the row.
Oh yeah.
But you have to do that on every line. You know, we talked about automation. Applying the same set of rules to 25 rows in a spreadsheet in my head is a complete waste of time.
Yep.
When I could apply the rules ahead of time and just say, here's all the stuff that meets criteria 1. Here's all, because that's what I wanted to know anyway when I looked at the report. So that's a very simple example of the difference between a data-centric report and a decision-centric report. It's all about, and on the decision-centric, I'm not even telling you the value of revenue because you didn't care. You just want to know, do I have to fix revenue? Right. So I don't need the numbers. Now, once I know that revenue and sales and maybe quality are my 3 areas that are in trouble, now I might want to go into the data to find out how much trouble they're in.
Right.
But from an efficiency standpoint, when we look at regular reporting, you have to look at rows and you have to analyze the row sometimes to come to the conclusion that you didn't have to look at it in the first place, right? Because everything's fine.
Oh, yeah.
What a horrible waste of time.
I mean, there's a lot of people who look at the same reports they've been looking at for multiple years, and they're changing their decisions. And it doesn't mean that what they see in that report means they should change their decision.
Yeah.
They just have been. You know what I mean? So it's, this says up. I got to go ahead and hire more people. And it's like, no, you really shouldn't. It just meant when you had a team of 20, you should go to 25. It doesn't mean you should go from 400 to 500. That's a very different metric because now you've got to judge something different. But I love your approach how you're like, not only what is your KPI, but what makes it happy and sad. You know what I mean? That's hard. It's got to be hard for people to get down to the bottom of sometimes because a lot of people.
Well, there's the what makes it happy and sad, which is the business acumen question, which is also the more important question.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
But even before that, to me, it's the implication for my choice. It's if this is happy and it's happy and improving, what does that actually mean for my business? Well, that means you don't have to worry about it. If this is happy and it's starting to decrease, what does that mean for my business? Well, that means you should watch it. You don't have to do anything but you want to keep an eye. So that's the key is it's understanding not just the metric. And I mean, the driver comes second. If I know it's sad, now I have to know why it might be sad. But first, I just want to know what do all these these different permutations my metrics can take and apply from an action standpoint. Because when I look at a report, I don't look at reports for numbers. And everyone's like, Brad, that's the dumbest thing I ever heard. You don't look at reports for numbers. You look at reports because you want to know, is there an action I have to take right now? And you use the numbers to get there. I'm trying to jump over that and say, let me just show you, here's the different sets of actions available. And here's the different things in your world that need each one of these actions. It's based on the data. It's based on the number, but I don't want, it's not about the number. I want you to focus immediately on the decision or action. That's a decision-centric view of doing things.
I remember when we were talking too, I was telling you about a client of mine that I said, I can build your report that shows you whatever numbers you want, but I want to know what levers you pull or what levers your managers can pull when they see new information. What are you ready for them to do? And a lot of times directors or VPs are like, whoa, they can double check with me, and it's like, no. The reason to have this information pushed down is because you're going to have go, no-go criteria for these things. You're going to kind of distribute some of that decision making on down, which can be a really powerful thing. I remember we talked about a story about that where you had somebody where you were able to push some of that stuff a little lower from the C-suite down to like the manager level, and it just changed the way they did it.
One thing is you said that I was reminded of, and this gets back to when I started saying that I think I was fortunate. It was an accident coming up through the consumer side, because on the consumer side, my world was those levers, and so it was natural. So by the time I actually ever got into the data, I already knew the levers because my life was pulling those levers and reacting to those
You're looking
levers.
For key things because either you're pulling the lever or you're not. That's all you care about.
Right? Because that was my job, was actually pulling the levers. It wasn't to read the report.
Yep.
But I find so often that people don't have that basic business acumen. I would say that I don't want to say turn down because I never try to turn people down, but I try to redirect people. Probably about 15 to 25% of the time, I'll get a leader call me and say, we need a course on using data better. And I'll talk to them for 15 minutes. And at the end, I'll say, your people know how to use data. Their problem is they don't understand your business. And that gets to your levers. And I'll say, if you told your team that these 5 things were in red status, whatever red status means, how many people on your team could tell you the 3 to 5 common things that cause that red status to occur? He's like, probably none of them. I said, okay. I said, now, how many people on your team can tell you the 3 or 4 options you have and levers you could pull to get it out of red status? He said, probably none of them. I said, okay, you don't need a data course. You need a course on how your business works, because they all can interpret the fact that it's red. The problem is they don't know why or how to fix it. And that's, I think where we sometimes see the disconnect between the analyst community and the business community is we don't always have enough business acumen. So when you don't understand the business, all you can do is report the data because you have nothing else to do with it. And you report more data probably than is needed, because since you don't know how they're going to use it or what they're going to do with it, you want to make sure they have it if they need it. So I'm going to give you
in case. Yeah,
I'm going to give you the extra 5 columns because I don't know which columns you need, but that's not what we want to do. And so I think, to me, I think business acumen is one of the most important skills for a data analyst, probably as important as the functional technical skills of analyzing data.
What kind of acumen do you think would be an important thing for these people to rate? Let's say, so you say we're not a training podcast, but I definitely plan on end up doing some of these trainings. But let's say I was going to build out some of these soft skills for people. What are some of the business acumen they should definitely look to improve on that maybe they're not already? Like understanding business metrics? Is it just the soft skills of communication, or what kind of?
So when I talk straight business acumen, communication is actually a whole nother, that's the other core skill that you need, because at the end of the day, if people can't understand what you found out, it's the same as not having found it out in the first place. So
then you got to get transmitting and receiving, right? There's 2 sides of the coin. There's a whole lot with that. Yeah.
It's very close to my heart. And we could talk about that for a really long time. But, business acumen, I sort of break down business acumen in 3 kinds of ways. To me, there's the how businesses work generically. So if you're a good analyst, you should understand that, all businesses, no matter what they are, have certain kinds of things, right? All businesses have a financial flow from something that you do to something. How do you translate a customer dollar into profit for your business? A lot of things have to happen. How does a dollar flow through your business from the customer's hand to your bank account? You should have that financial acumen. You should also have process. You also should have good process acumen. Which, and again, process acumen is all about, okay, what are the core process? How does my company, how do they get stuff that they need to use to build their product? If it's a product, if it's a service, right? And then so the supply chain, right? Again, how do we get from raw materials or raw ideas, if it's a knowledge company, to helping giving someone something of value? What's that chain look like? I should And you need this at 2 levels. You should understand how a generic supply chain works. And then you need to understand how your company's supply chain works, right? Because there might be some nuance there. So you've got financial, you've sort of got, to me, the process acumen. And then there's sort of the strategic acumen, which is, what does my company do? How does my company make money? Not in the mechanical sense of financial acumen, but what is the thing that we provide that people are willing to pay for? And who are those people that are willing to pay for it? And how do we think about those people? So those are the kinds of acumen I think that are really, really critical for anyone in business in general, but for a data person, because knowing that, I could start predicting when someone comes to me and says, okay, I need this logistics report. I could start to anticipate, well, really what they care about isn't a logistics report. What they're really probably caring about is, are we fulfilling things in time? Okay, well, I know what gets in the way of fulfilling things at a customer store. We might not have inventory in place, so we can't fulfill it. Yep. We might have inventory, but we might not have any trucks to bring it there, right? So yep. I could start really understanding what they might need to see on this report if I have that level of acumen.
I love that you said all that stuff too, because I mean, there's a lot of people who listen, I think, who either have a degree in business or have a degree in data, and it's like, how do you bridge that gap? I had a boss once that told me, Rob, you got to decide: are you going to be a data guy, or are you going to manage people? Because you can't do both. And I was like, I disagree completely, because too. I feel like if you're going to be a guy who can manage people, you should know how to use data to fortify that. Now, that doesn't mean you have to. There's a lot of great managers that I've known that would get terrified at opening up Excel. They're people managers. They're great at managing people, and data is not their thing, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think a lot of data people get classified as these mousy, I can't interact with other people, I can't see the business as a whole, right? And I don't know if that's necessarily true, because I've met a lot of really business acumen data people, but I also think that it's really helpful for somebody who is data centric to look at the whole company. I remember I was working at a logistics company, and I was just doing some accounting work. They wanted to turn off that AS400 they had running since the 70s, and they were like, we should use you to write some scripts. I went in the warehouse and talked to the warehouse people and how things came in and out, because I wanted to know what happens to my code when it goes downhill, like when it goes past me, happy path, sad path. And they're like, we've never had an analyst come back here before. Like, you really care about how it all comes together. And I said, the only way I can deliver a full solution is if I make sure I understand the full picture. If I just deliver you the reports you asked me for because that's what you're paying me for, I'm not doing my full service. I'm going to grab my money and run and say thank you, but you're going to be stuck in a problem. And that's not, how it should go. But yeah, I think a lot of people are doing the same thing right now too. They're like, oh, well, I just do analyst reporting, Rob. I'm not going to go walk around the warehouse and ask questions. It's not my role. I think they should. I think it behooves them to kind of see how, not every day, don't go stand there every day and chat. Like, that's not cool. Like, but go poke around and learn about the rest of the business. Learn how your part fits in with the customer, or learn how billing in general works. A lot of people have no idea how billing works, and there's so much uncollected, and we go spend so much money selling all these customers we never get to collect, and you don't realize what is that, So yeah, I totally love where you're going with that. I think that needs to happen.
And from a career standpoint, I think it's going to it makes anyone stand out. Again, I don't want to just focus on data people. Anyone who's in an internal function in a business, if you're a finance person, a data person, a learning person, the more you can understand about the business, the more you're going to be able to create value. I remember it was funny. I was having a conversation with a client. We were talking about some reporting, and I forgot what they were talking about. But I said, and I corrected one of their rules. And, and they're like, well, the rule is if this and this. I said, well, that doesn't make sense. Wouldn't the rule be more if this other thing happened? And they looked at me. They're like, how do you know so much about our business? You just got here. I said, I don't know anything about your business. I understand how businesses work in general. And what you just said wouldn't work in most businesses,
And that's so surprising too. So many companies think that they're special, that they're the only company who does that. And nobody does it like me. Like, we ship differently. And it's like, if you put products in the mail, you're like a logistics company. And there are hundreds of them, and there's nothing wrong with that. How you special sauce your customers is up to you, but you still have packages come in, move through, and come out.
Everyone thinks I have that so much with my, I have a workshop series. I have 5 workshops on data-driven decision-making. The first thing everyone asks me, every new client asks me is, can you customize this for our company? And and I always say 2 things. I say, well, first, we have to define what you mean by customized. But I said, generally, no, you don't need it customized, because as long as your people are human, like everybody else on the planet, they're going to make the exact same decisions using data. So your people aren't making unique cognitive mistakes with data. So We don't. Now, what I will tell them, though, is because what I think they might mean is I said, now I will use examples from your company when I'm showing them the mistakes that they make. I said, but the workshop itself is going to be exactly, everyone who goes through my workshop has the same experience, the same tools, the same techniques. What's different is I will sometimes show a specific example so that if I'm talking to a procurement team, I don't want to show them an example of a training and development report just because, you know, I don't want them to waste their time having to try to understand some context. So I'll tailor the context, but I don't customize the content. And everyone's like, but we have a really strong data culture and you're telling us that, you know, we should focus more on the decision. I said, every client I have tells me they have a really strong data culture.
Right.
Right. So the people aren't that different. It's sort of funny. And even what I teach, you know, again, I teach some of the cognitive part of decision making. I do a lot of teaching about communication of information. And again, it's in the context of data, but it's really about communicating any message. And what I tell people, I'm very upfront about this. I'm like, nothing I'm telling you in the communication section is something that I invented. I said, in fact, some of the things I'm telling you are 2,000 years old and were written by Aristotle. You know,
isn't it nuts? Yeah, totally.
You don't need a new communication thing because it turns out the old communication things work really well. And so there's a lot of just basic blocking and tackling. And it was funny, just on LinkedIn today, I saw someone post something and I almost responded and I thought that they might think that I'm trolling. I really wanted to have a genuine conversation, but, you know, people read things wrong. But the complaint was, they said, you know, everyone's looking for a lot of experience, even though all of our problems are new these days. I'm like, our problems, the context of our problems are new. 90% of our problems are the same problems we've had in business for a pretty long time. And I think, and to me, that's why having that basic business acumen makes it so that every time something changes in the context, it doesn't seem like it's new. When you have really good business acumen, you look at it and say, you know, this is still whatever. This is still marketing. We're just doing it through a social media channel. And there's certainly some considerations that are different, but some of the basic principles are going to be this, you know, the same goal and principles are going to be the same. What we have to learn that's new is how do you apply these in this new environment with this new type of technology? But
100%.
You know, when the e-commerce craze came, I was building training and we were building training. Everything was e-whatever. So e-CRM, e-procurement, e-finance.
Oh, goodness.
And, you know, because everyone was freaking out, like, we don't know how to work in this new e-world. When we built the e-suite of courses, 90% of every course was just, if it was an e-CRM course, 90% of the course was CRM. And 10% was, and here's how all this happens now, right? 90% of the procurement course was the basics of how does procurement work. 10% was, and how does it do it now with all of, you know, with on the web. So,
and here's a computer.
That's really important, you know, that there's some basic blocking and tackling that if you have, you are going to be invaluable because you're going to be able to make sense of a very complicated world because you're going to realize that some of that complexity is an illusion.
I love it. You are unknowingly an advertisement for my class because, like, so the first thing I did when I took some time off of work and I said, I want to build out this DataLAB. I want to build out this company that helps people. Was I built a class and I call it Side Hustle Like a Business because I figure it's going to be for the self-starters and you want to run it like a business. You need to write your ideas out. You need to be clear with yourself. You need to have ways to iterate through your ideas, but you need to know, like, what is marketing? What is management? What is accounting? What is a lawyer? And how are they not the same? And how are they going to help you make decisions and not help you make decisions, you know? Because a lot of people are like, well, I've got a lawyer and accountant. They do all my financial stuff. And it's like, that is not your decision making. That is your legal liability. That is maybe your reporting liability to the government, but do not outsource your decision making to those people. That's not their role, you know?
Yeah. Get some advice from, you know, get their advice. And again, on some of the functional mechanical things, I have my
critical people to have
file my taxes because she can do that way better than I can.
Yep.
Yeah, but running my business and structuring things, you know, I need to understand the difference between, you know, a cost of service and a capital investment. Because otherwise, when I send her the stuff, she can't do my taxes right if she's having to come back to me and say, wait, well, now what was this for and how did you use it?
And that's what I said to my accountant too. Yeah, he's like, I can charge you $100 an hour and take your receipts and turn them into a spreadsheet, or you can just send me a spreadsheet. And I said, I'll send you a spreadsheet all day. I'll just export it from my bank account. I mean, it's really not hard if you have those to your point, when you have those business skills or those data skills, a lot of other things seem to get simpler. You know, I met a lady who handwrites everything she spends every night because she got just her identity stolen twice over a couple years. So now she's just paranoid. So every day they write everything. And she saw that she overpaid for pizza She thought they were going to charge them $10 on her credit card, and they didn't. So I'm sorry, underpaid. So she called them and said, I'm going to come to you and drive out the $10.29 for this pizza. And they're like, lady, we don't care. Like, how do you even know? And she's like, I hand wrote it. 2 days ago on Friday, you were supposed to charge it. And I said, Karen, and her name is literally Karen. I said, why don't you just export it from your website? Like, just log in and export the account. She goes, what is export? And I was like,
it's very funny.
I didn't realize to tell her that, like, you've been spending hours handwriting this stuff, and you could just go hit boom and make sure it's all there in seconds, and have set up a rule. So maybe once a month you double check, so you don't have that anxiety, but you don't have to spend half an hour every night, and
so crazy. But people don't, those simple basics, it's funny. So I learned something really interesting. So when I worked at Accenture, Anderson Consulting, Accenture.
Yeah, sure.
And they had a metric. And I only got exposed to this metric because I was building a course and they wanted to include the metric when they were teaching their managers. And it was a metric called inventory, which was really interesting because I grew up, like I said, in my stepfather's factory. We produced product. We were a products company, not a services company. So for me, inventory was pretty obvious, right? It was stuff built and sitting on the shelf. So I was thinking, like, how could a services we don't build products, and inventory, and this is, if you from a business deck makes sense. Inventory is work that has been done for the client but has not yet been invoiced to the client. And the goal was you want to have small inventory, because if you don't, it means you're carrying the cost because you're paying your employees and you haven't been reimbursed by the client. So. And I don't know why, but this idea of inventory has always been in my head. So my rule in my business is within 24 hours of finishing a project, I need to get that invoice out the door. So I'm very on top of it. So I sent this company an invoice once, and it was funny. He forwarded the invoice to his finance team because I sent it to my contact. And I don't know what happened. If he forwarded it, something happened where I was CC'd on it accidentally. But this was one of those good stories where you're CC'd and they actually say something nice rather than we got to pay this idiot, we hate him.
Yeah, right, exactly.
But he said, here's Brad's invoice, and then he wrote, this guy has invoicing totally nailed down. and I saw that, and I called him.
Yes.
I'm like, just out of curiosity, I don't even know what that means. How would you not have invoice? I said, I sent you an invoice. I'm like, I did this work. You owe me this money. Here's when it's due. He's like, you would not believe what people send us for an invoice. He said sometimes they'll just send us sort of like a description on a piece of paper, and then they'll send their receipts, but they won't have them itemized. And so that was the funny thing. But I was like, how do you run a business without understanding how to invoice?
Right.
And it goes back to that basic, just that basic, simple business acumen. I just wrote a thing. My business just turned 15 years old. And I wrote this little thing, 15 things I learned in 15 years about being self-employed. And one of the first ones was, no matter what, we like to focus on the thing that we're in business for. So I love data-driven decision making. But when you're self-employed, you have to be a business person. I have to understand it. I have to market. I have to understand contracts. I don't have to understand them as much as my lawyer. I need to understand them enough so that I could look at them and know when I have to get my lawyer involved, right?
Yeah.
I need to understand finance enough so I could do these. In some cases, and this isn't meant to sound as much of a brag as it might, I understand a lot of my clients' financial payment systems better than they do, partly because it doesn't affect them if I don't get paid. But so I'll often call and I'll say, there's a problem with my invoice. And they'll say, no, everything's fine. I looked in the system. I'll say, no, there's a problem at the end. And they'll be like, well, why do you think there's a problem? There's a date that says, payment date, such and such. It's in 75 days. And I'll say, I said, you realize that's a calculated field. When I submit the invoice, it just adds 75 days. And that doesn't mean you're actually going to pay me on that day.
Yeah.
I said, the reason I'm concerned is because what matters is the status of the invoice approved, ready to pay. I said, because if it's not, it doesn't care what the date is. It's not getting paid.
It's so awesome. You know that inside of their system.
And I'm like, and right now the invoice is in process, and it's been in process for 3.5 months. And normally,
oh my God.
And normally it's in process for 3 days. So that tells me it's stuck. And then sure enough, they look into it. They're like, oh yeah, it was stuck. So, but I'm like, you have to learn your business. You also have to learn for certain things, your client's business. Because again, for most of them, it's not in their interest to understand how their payment system works. And I'm not saying
they're not making money off paying you.
Yeah,
it's not their business.
And I'm not saying they're doing it because they're callous. They actually have a job to do that does matter. And so they don't have time to learn about that part. So You got to know it. But even if you're inside a company, understanding those simple kinds of things is going to make you more useful and valuable at helping other people, especially if you're providing them a service. I could do my service better if I really understand what you do. And I think that's the key. And again, my job isn't to make you want to use my service. My job is to make my service so invaluable that you're begging for it. And I think that's where now I see it in the analytics spaces. I think sometimes we have the opposite mentality. It's my stuff, my analytics and my reporting and my models are so good, you're a fool for not using them. And that's not the right mindset. The mindset is, if you're not using them, I'm a fool for not making myself more usable.
I think your mindset that you have is the right mindset to have in going into this. Because, I mean, one leads you to improvement, what you're talking about doing. The other one leads you to some sort of I'm better than everybody type of mentality. And that's self-degrading over time. You know, it's not a position that'll help you gain power or influence
or friends
or anybody really. And what if you're wrong? You know, you could be just adamantly about this data you've been around for 20 years and it could change and all of a sudden it doesn't work that way and you're wrong now, but you've been doing it so long and you haven't flexed that muscle to switch perspectives and change and admit. I've seen people go through that, and it's a hard thing to see. But Brett, I've loved having you on here. This has been a really great talk. Yeah, honestly, I will somehow sweet talk you into making some content for the channel because I love the way you think, and I'm sure there's other people who would love it. Anybody, put comments down below if you want to see something from Brad and what you'd want him to talk about in decision making, and I will sweet talk him as best I can.
I'd love to talk about it. And Rob, I'll send you.
Yeah.
I actually have a series. It was three or four blog entries I wrote for what my model of business, what every person should understand about business acumen. And so it's like a high level article that introduces the main categories. And then there's a sub article on each category, financial, industry, whatever.
Oh my God, that's wonderful.
We'll throw links to that in the comments as well. If people just want to sort of see the framework, I might find it helpful as a good development path to try to just master all those areas and you're going to be in great shape.
Oh, I love it, Brad. Then one thing I make sure to always do, and Ryan, if there's anything else you want to do before I go ahead and do this, I'll give you a second. Otherwise, I'm going to give him a chance to shout out.
Oh, yeah. I'd like to cover what is arguably our most popular question here with you, Brad, if we can.
Oh, yes.
In your current position, do you deal with imposter syndrome? And do you have any tips for our viewers here on how to deal with that? Any methodologies, any thought processes, anything like that?
So I don't deal with imposter syndrome only because I have very little confidence. And so I always like to tell people, you know, in the time of, oh boy, I forgot who it was. What was the big company that had the big melt? Enron. There was that book that was written about Enron, Smartest Guy in the Room. Right, where basically sort of the culture was, you know, all of their guys thought they were always smarter than everyone else. I sort of have the counter Enron problem. I'm generally the least impressed with myself of anyone in the room. and so I don't really suffer too much from imposter syndrome because I'm always wondering, like, you know, am I really getting this? And so I try not to really portray myself. But I'll tell you, though, how I think I also, though, minimize having it is I only do things that I could be great at. And now at first you might think, well, that's a pretty arrogant statement, but you have to realize that means there's only like 4 things I do because I can't be good at anything else. And so I've really scoped like what I do in my business to only things I could be great at. And it's a very small number of things because what I discovered was where the imposter syndrome came from was, like, I used to go out, I used to have some change management offerings on my website. And I was okay. I had some good opinions and people liked the stuff I was saying, but I was no change management expert. And I knew I wasn't a change management expert. But when I was going in front of people, they wanted me to be a change management expert. And so that's where the imposter syndrome sort of would have come from for me was I feel like I know enough to be dangerous, but I'm also portraying myself as something more. So I said there's 2 ways to fix that. Either become great or stop doing it. And for me, I just decided I'm going to stop doing things that sort of put me in that imposter situation. So I don't know if that was a satisfying answer.
Hell yeah, that is.
Ryan.
Well, that's actually like, I feel that. I felt that answer on a personal level. I've in my career so far, and I'm only 28, so I haven't had a whole lot of time outside of college here, but I've kind of lived by that mentality. Like, I'm willing to try everything, but I really like to spend my time on the things I know I do well.
Yeah.
And so just to hear that, like, you know, like you said, some people might see it as negative. You know, there are a lot of people that are going to tell you should try everything and you can spend time to improve. And you're not saying necessarily, at least I don't think you are, that you can't do that. But why why not niche down and just be the best at the thing that you want to be the best at?
I think that's it. And I guess, you know, in the personal development world, people would say that I guess that's the growth mindset or the strengths mindset versus, you know, the deficiency mindset. And that's part of it. I don't think of it that way, but I think it's aligned. But for me, it's almost taking it to the extreme where I'll say I want to capitalize on my strengths, certainly. But I also say, if I can't be great at it, I'm not going to do it. So even if it's a strength I have, if I can't be the absolute, you know, best that I think I could be at it, even if I'm really good at it and it's a strength, I'm not going to even pursue it. And I think part of it, there's a humility we all have to have. And you just sort of alluded to it, Ryan. And Rob, you said something too that reminded me, like, what if I'm wrong? And you know, one piece of advice, I give it to leaders and I give it to other people, but mostly to leaders. I said, you know, you need to sort of have two messages tattooed on one on each wrist. On your left wrist, it needs to say, I'm confident that I'm right because I've done the due diligence and I've done the work. And on the right hand, it needs to say, but I still might be wrong because I'm human. And you need to realize that we all live in a world where both of those things need to be true at the same time. I've got to be so, you know, I have to have done such a good job that I'm confident in everything I'm telling you, but I also understand I might have missed something. And I'll leave with one more thing. I know, Rob, you're trying to get us off here.
No, I do not mind at all. Honestly, we could do a whole other call because I love your mindset around this. And I think it's another level into what we want to teach people, because I don't want people to go get a bunch of entry-level data analyst jobs and be drones. I want them to be free-thinking individuals. And I think you need to first understand how to use a spreadsheet so you can have the ability to take all these large concepts and sort them out. But then once you're sorting those concepts out, you need to do it intelligently and you need to really think about what you're doing. And that's what I think you spend a lot of effort on. And I love it.
And always knowing that goal. But the thing with the right, which I think is unusual for, you know, when in a consulting role, I was talking with an executive once and she was asking me about measuring something. I forgot what it was now, but I'm like, you can't measure that. I said, there's no point in trying to do an ROI on whatever they were trying to do ROI on. I said, it's one of those things. I said, you can't, I said, you're not going to be able to, in a valid or more importantly, reasonable way, figure out the ROI on that. And she's like, well, she goes, well, what if this other consulting company keeps telling us we can, what should I tell them? I said, well, I would ask them how to do it. Cause clearly maybe they know something I don't.
Yeah.
But she just looked at me like, how could you admit that maybe you don't know it? I said, because I don't. I said, based on everything I do know, I don't believe you can do this. I said, but I don't know everything. So maybe there is a way. And I said, by the way, if there is, please tell me, because I would actually like to know. But it was just very interesting. And I think that's a weird cultural thing that we have is people aren't willing to, people don't believe that you could be confident in what you know, but also recognize that you don't know everything, that those could actually occur at the same time. And that's really important.
On that topic too, I work in marketing, like Rob said, I build websites and I do SEO and that sort of thing. And that has been one of the biggest credibility establishing factors in my life over the last 5 years, is being able to look at a client and go, I don't know that right now, but I'm confident that I can find out for you.
Ryan, that is so huge. I can't tell you how many times I've told a client, I am not the best guy for this. And again, I remember there was one of my clients, they were building a leadership curriculum out and there was 5 topics. And so there were 3, I said, I could do these 3. And the person's like, well, but the other 2, you know something about. I said, I know something about them. I said, but in this case, X would be much better at producing those 2 modules. And he said, Brad, he goes, you tend to tell us more about other companies who could do the stuff we're asking you to do than you actually do for us. He said, most of the consultants we bring in, when we said we had 5 modules, they would have told us they could build them before we even told them what the 5 modules were. I said, well, here's the thing. I said, it sounds like I'm being nice. And of course I do try to have a respectful, I said, but at the end of the day, I want you to know that when I tell you I could do something, you should have absolutely no question in your mind that I could do it. I said, and the only way I could get there is if I'm 100% honest about all the things I can do. And like I said, there's only 4 things I'm good at. So more often than not, I'm going to tell you to get someone else.
Yeah, exactly. Because then you're free to just be an expert at the things you're an expert at.
Yeah.
I love it, man. I love it. No, I think that's a perfect answer to the question. I mean, and that's why we wanted to ask a bunch of people, because everybody has to deal with that a little bit differently. And it could be, to your point, you feel it a little bit. You're like, no, I don't need to be this because I can just be the expert in these things. And that's a perfectly acceptable answer. There's nothing wrong with that.
And I think that spills over to DataLAB as a project too. Just looking at what Rob and myself and the other members have been trying to build here at this point. Rob's a data analyst. He's not a web guy. He knows enough about web to be dangerous, but he hired me. And, you know, I think there's a lot of success in that idea of delegating, I think, like as more of a broader concept. And I think that's something that over the last couple of years, a lot of like these management courses and these instructors per se have been teaching the management level people is like delegate. Like it doesn't all have to be on your plate. It's okay to not be the best at it as long as you know what the finished product is supposed to look like and you know who's best to work on that product.
Absolutely. You know, and you know, I think everybody should have their own business at some point in their life because you learn that lesson, Ryan, much faster when you have your own business, because if I don't delegate, I'm not getting, like, I can't teach workshops if I'm doing my taxes, right? And so I had to learn very quickly that I really need to figure out what I need to spend my time on. And I need to just find people who could do everything else for me. And it's helped me run a really lean, mean business. I used to do an example. I wish I had a slide with this example because I'll probably botch it. But for the more data inclined, because, you know, people are always like, well, but I don't want to delegate, but I could do it faster. But I always say, but here's the thing. I said, the numbers are not in your favor because if you have 3 tasks that are going to take 8 hours each, it will take you 24 hours to do them. I said, and so it's going to take you 3 days before all 3 tasks are done. I said, if you have a team, even if each person does it at 50% of your speed, you're still going to get done a day sooner than if you tried to do them on your own. So if you say, even if you say I could do it faster, you have to be so many orders of magnitude faster to do all those tasks yourself than even people who work at half your efficiency or a third of your efficiency. They're still going to finish the collection of tasks before you. And I used to have a graph because we wanted to make it, you know, I used to show people sort of mathematically how quickly you being the fastest person still can't, if you're doing anything that more than one task at a time, the graph quickly falls off. And the productivity of the entire group is actually much higher. The efficiency might be lower, but the productivity is higher. And so, Ryan, I think you are so spot on. But I think that mindset of, but I could do it faster, it's because you could do one thing faster. You can't do 10 things faster than 10 people who are simultaneously working on those 10 things when you could only work on one at a time.
Brad, I'll be honest with you. I wish we had an hour to talk because that idea of productivity versus efficiency is, I think, something that is also elusive to a lot of businesses. You know, everybody thinks about that efficiency, but they don't actually think about the throughput.
Yeah. And that's the key,
Ryan,
right?
I got a meeting next week with George, who came on episodes and episodes ago, and he's going to start building out something that determines what are the main data analyst positions, junior, senior, and, you know, entry, middle, and senior. And what do they have in common, and what skills do they need? And I would love to work with Brad to help get them all level set on thinking about the big picture the right way. You know what I mean? I feel like anybody applying to any of those jobs would need some sort of level set in, to your point, business acumen / what not to do with data. Just once you have these spreadsheets, don't go bet your house on it, right? Things like that. Don't go run the odds of roulette in a spreadsheet and then go to the casino and say, I've got this. But I feel like, you know, that level of acumen could definitely help people. So we'll for sure be in touch, Brad.
Absolutely. Great.
This has been awesome. One thing I always do give somebody time to do, take a minute or two, call out to whatever you think's important. I know one thing we said before is you're great at decision making, but marketing is your Achilles heel. So here's your minute of fame. Where would you like people to go to check you out? What website? Or do you have a charity you support or something you want to sell?
Sure. So yes, you could check me out at Avail Advisors, AVAIL advisors.com. You'll see my website. It's, you know, as we've been talking, my ears perked up when you mentioned that Ryan does websites, because remember I said I'm only good at 4 things. Websites isn't one of them. So
that's why I pay Ryan.
But, you know, at least that'll give you a general idea. You know, I focus on 4 things, helping, and they're all under the umbrella of simplifying. If you want to get things done, you got to make them simple. That's how life works. So I help people simplify their problems, decisions, data, and communication. And so that's what the people could check out on the website. And most of my work is workshops and coaching. I do communication coaching around telling your story. And then I do the decision-making workshops. I have a big workshop that's a big full-day workshop, or 4 sessions when we do it virtually. I do that, around the world for Fortune 50 companies all the way down to small $100 million businesses. It's a great course. And then I've also got a couple sort of cutouts of that course, 1 to 2 hour standalone. One is about how you manage a story from a data standpoint, and what that means as a leader. What's your role in keeping the story alive while people are looking at the data? Because most leaders make the mistake of falling into the data rather than their job is to keep an eye on the story. So managing your story does that. I have another one called Sharpening Your Point, which is all about the communication of information and how you could do that a little better. And again, I try to bring some unique psychology into it. So it's not, my communication isn't the say it with graph stuff. I don't have anything against that. I'm not teaching you how to design a PowerPoint slide so that it looks good. Because again, when you see my website, you'll know I don't know how to make things look good. I help you design a PowerPoint slide so that it requires the least amount of cognitive effort for your audience to understand. Then you could talk to a graphic designer to then also make it look good. So that's why I do Sharpening Your Point. And then again, Rethinking Data is the big one, big workshop that really takes you through all of my techniques from how do you better manage bias? How do you frame your decisions and figure out what data you need so you're not analyzing more than you need? And then how do you tell the story? And again, it's probably my final point would be, you never should be telling a data story. I hate that term in the industry right now. You should tell a business story supported by data. Executives don't want a story about their data. They want a story about their business, but they want the story to be true. And that's where the data come in. So check me out. That's where you can find me. I'm on LinkedIn as well. And I'm always happy to talk about it. I love this topic, so I'm always happy to talk about it.
Well, thank you for coming on the show, Brad. I know it's been a lot for me.
Ryan, appreciate it.
I know it helps Ryan, too, to expose him to more people, too, because I know Ryan graduated right out of school and started working for his company. And I try to tell him there's a lot of people like you, but a lot of people run into the contrary, right? We see a lot of the clients you've seen rather than people like you who help fix the client situation. So it's nice to share that with the world and let people know it's a good way to act. And I hope people do reach out for you directly. It's nice to reach out and contact you. So all those links will be in the descriptions on the YouTube page. Now, we did just start launching this on multi-platforms, so people will be able to check it out on Spotify and all these, Audible and Google, but YouTube's where we'll post all of our links and stuff. So, well, thank you so much. You will definitely be back on. I do want to talk later about that cognitive steps. I know we alluded to it a little bit here, but like how you talk about, and I'll just hint at it for the future conversation, how if we look at a graph and the graph's got 4 different colors to the legend and 4 different lines, well, now I've got to look at the graph, I've got to look at the legend, I've got to interpret the legend, I've got to interpret the lines, I've got to see if the lines go up and down, and then what do they do compared to each other? Each of those is multiple different steps, and you could lose somebody at any one of them. So how can you simplify what you're telling people so you're not doing that? But I'm going to totally leave that spoiler for the next episode. All right. So thank you so much, Brad.
Thank you, Rob. Take care. Have a great weekend. See you later, Ryan. Thank you.
It was a pleasure meeting you, Brad. Thanks for chatting with us today.
All right. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you for joining Podcast Like a Business on our journey to discover just how everything is data. If you want to watch the next episode or one of our favorites, click on the thumbnails here for more Podcast Lab, and find us wherever you like to listen to podcasts.